I would love to come and see it.
You should do so.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on biotech revolution. Let me unpackage the title for you a little bit, sort of setting your expectation for what we're going to describe. So if you paid attention to how the title is rendered in writing, you will see that the R is in brackets. So I like to think about it as we're going to look at the revolution aspect of biotech, but also evolution aspect. And as a biologist myself, I will allow myself to remind you that evolution, of course, means gradual change over time, crucially adaptation, so change to changing conditions, changing environment. And revolution, of course, has that element of rapid changes, again, response to the changing situations around, but often pivoting. I am Magdalena Skipper. I'm editor-in-chief of Nature, which is a multidisciplinary journal publishing original research as well as news and other context of research. And I'll be leading this discussion with really a very interesting and diverse panel here. I mentioned already that I'm a biologist. I'm actually a geneticist by training, so at least from a research perspective, this is sort of my natural home, talking about biotechnology. We'll be looking at biotech in general from a perspective of where it stands now, following some 2-3 decades of knowledge acquisition, basic fundamental knowledge, but of course that knowledge allows us now to design, to engineer, and move forward. But we will also be talking about the business models around biotech and how that compares, how it's different from other tech sector, and what biotechnology itself enables in a broader context. So let me introduce the panel to you. So starting from the far end, we have Jason Kelly, who is co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks. And Ginkgo is building platforms to enable customers to program cells as easily as they could program computers. That's your
That's the dream.
That's your dream. There you go. Next to Jason, we have Joanna Shields, who is CEO of BenevolentAI, and a company who's really transitioned from a small startup, now looking at clinical stage AI-enabled drug discovery. Next, we have Mads Thomsen, who is by training a pharmacology researcher with expertise in therapeutics, but now CEO of Novo Nordisk Foundation. And right next to me here, we have Minister Rama Rao, who's Minister for Municipal Administration and Urban Development, Industries and Commerce, and Information Technology. Minister Rao is a biotechnologist by training, and he's a cabinet minister in the government of Telangana. So let me start my panel off with a really broad scene-setting question. So we all know that biotech has been around for quite some time. We've already agreed that it's evolved over that time and aspects of it at least undergoing revolution. But looking at the sector today, what is it that excites you about it the most? I'd love one example from you. And then one example of something that you feel the sector really needs to tackle now, a real issue. And it can be an example from within the sector itself or an enabling challenge that needs to be met in the context. Jason, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, yeah, and maybe I'll give a little kind of biotech history over that era, because I'm sort of a student of that. So if you think of the 80s and 90s, that was, to me, really when biotech was born, right? All the big companies you know of today, the Genentechs and Monsanto, they were formed during that period. So what technologies came together to allow that? There were three. There's PCR, right? So polymerase chain reaction. This allowed you to essentially amplify a piece of DNA from a natural organism, pull it out, and have a lot of it in the lab. And then there were restriction enzymes, okay? And this would allow you to cut the sides of the DNA, almost to leave like little sticky ends, all right, and also to cut the genome of a cell. And then once you had that, you could cut and paste. So you could insert the genome in, but where would you put it? So there was also a big learning in bacterial cells, a biological learning, the discovery of the operon. This was basically, how do you turn on a gene in a cell? So once you knew those three things, you could amp up a gene, cut it out, and put it in the right spot where it would turn on inside a cell. And that was human insulin, Genentech, right? That was the beginnings of that. It was those three technologies coming together. And then fast forward another 10 years, agrobacteria, which allowed you to bring DNA into a plant. CMV promoter, which is sort of the operon, the on switch for plants. And you had Monsanto. You had traits. You had Roundup Ready, right? You had insect tolerance. You had BT crops. And they were built on top of those underlying technologies. Once the technologies were there, the industrial revolution was sort of inevitable once you figured out where they were going to be applied. And I think that is something that, so let me speak about what I think are the technologies that are exciting today. But I think one point to make is back then, they didn't know actually at the beginning where to apply it. Genentech, which had our ticker DNA, Ginkgo is now DNA on the New York Stock Exchange. They were called DNA at the time. They were in 4 different markets,
Nice.
right? They were working on indigo for genes. They were working on insulin. They were working on the plant stuff. They were working on enzymes, which our friends over here at Novozymes ended up dominating. Who knew? And then insulin hit, and they became a pharma company. And so here we sit today, okay? And I think there's 3 technologies that have come together. Laboratory automation, which generates huge reams of data about how biology works. Okay, so we moved away from a scientist at the bench working by hand to robots doing it. What do you do with that data? Machine learning and AI. You can now analyze that data thanks to our compute power. Okay, so that's sort of technology number 1. Number 2, CRISPR. Updated tools, molecular biology tools, CRISPR, things like genomic barcoding that allow you to now have way more control over where you want to insert DNA across an organism, and DNA synthesis that allows you to make that DNA. Okay? And then finally, the learning side of things is genomics. So because we've had a revolution in our ability to read DNA over the last 30 years, we now have huge corpuses of raw DNA data from nature that we can mine to find new biology to develop new products. And so those 3 things coming together, sort of the lab automation and the data, the editing tools, and then finally our understanding of biology from genomics, means there's a new moment. What industries? I'd be curious to hear from people what they think, because I don't think it's clear yet what it's going to be that gets disrupted, what the next Genentech is, what the next Monsanto is. But those are the technologies that I think are the ones driving it.
Fantastic. I never thought I would hear the word operon at the World Economic Forum meeting. Congratulations. But this was a fantastic, in essence, history of the industry. And so your excitement really is about the confluence, that real moment of the confluence of 3 enabling
we only had
points
pieces,
that you
right?
identified.
In the 2000s, you had the genomics revolution. It wasn't actually enough.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't have the ML to deal with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so today, the things are kind of clicking together in a way that it just hasn't over the last 30 years. And so I think there's a new moment. Yeah.
Fantastic. Joanna, what do you find most exciting?
What I'm most excited about is I'm new to this industry, first of all. I'm a technologist, so I've been building and scaling technology platforms for 35 years. This particular area, what got me interested in it is the potential to take all these different data types that you're describing and all this innovation and bring it into a discovery environment and enable scientists to take advantage of all this disparate data, the exponential growth of data, and enable them to make better decisions. The thing that got me most interested in this is that whilst there's 10,000 papers published every day, not all of them are peer-reviewed by Nature, but there's a lot of biomedical information being generated. There's patient records, there's genetics, genomics. Every day we're generating exponential amounts of data. But there's no way in which you can empower scientists to access all of that and make it useful in decision making. So what we have set out to do is ingest all the world's biomedical information and make it accessible and useful to scientists, giving them a suite of tools that enables them to ask and answer complex biological questions and get an answer in real time that takes advantage of all those data sets, and then refine and develop a hypothesis. So we started out by saying, let's build tech in the service of science. So we brought technologists and scientists together, and we sat down and understood what they needed because you can't build tech if you don't understand what a research scientist needs. And so we build a suite of tools that enables them to decipher complex disease biology, understand multifactorial influences on disease, and formulate a better hypothesis to start with. But then we took everything that a scientist needs to consider down the line, whether it's target progressibility or whether you can actually drug that chemical, that protein. So what we've done now is we've brought all of this decision making into one environment. So by the time we validate a target and we do the experimentation and put it into our portfolio for development, we have a very high confidence ratio that these predictions are going to result in a successful drug for a complex multifactorial disease.
So thank you for this. Actually, you very masterfully blended the part that you're excited by and the challenge, and it's really about that enormous body of data with complexity that we actually don't fully understand yet. I think you have a wonderful quote on your company website from Nobel Prize winner Sidney Brenner.
Yes.
Right? About
we're drowning in a sea of data, and yet we're starved for information and knowledge.
Exactly. So that real challenge, the knowledge is in there.
That's right.
It's a matter of, just to put it trivially, fishing it out, if you're going to run with the ocean analogy. Thank you for that. And we'll come back to elements that you touched on just now about the intersection of technologists working with scientists and what that means in practice.
It's very humbling, I have to say. To be in the presence of scientists and to apply this technology and try to unlock something that is so vital to all of us as human beings. And yeah, it's a humbling experience.
I rather suspect that it's humbling in both directions.
It could be.
Mads, can I turn to you from your perspective, rather different from what we just heard? What excites you? And maybe in that context, where does the foundation turn its attention to? And also, if you can think of a challenge at the same time.
Yeah, thanks. I think my knee-jerk reaction as a former head of R&D at Novo Nordisk for more than 2 decades would be to be excited by the medical use of biotechnology. So I'll refrain from doing that because we have Jason and others who will speak to that. I would nonetheless remind ourselves of your tour down memory lane. The early days of pharmaceutical biotechnology are highly exciting, but we have to learn from them, because what happened in those days, the days of Genentech, Biogen, Chiron and so on, was actually that the US left Europe way behind because of a challenge that I'll get back to in just a few minutes, because it's highly relevant to what I'm going to say now. So I would rather say we are, as a foundation, equally committed to human health and planetary health. And on the planetary health part of it, we believe that biotech solutions, green and white biotech, can really be used and scaled and save the planet. Whether it is taking bad carbon and capturing it from the atmosphere or from the point source of emission and converting it into anything from feed, food, biofuel, bioplastic, or even substrates for fermentation to replace glucose in that part, and thereby enhancing the biodiversity by decreasing the land use and so on. I feel there are big uses of biotechnology in those areas, including, as you a little bit hinted at, using CRISPR-Cas, not GMO technology, but gene editing technology on the endogenous genome of crops, so that we can, rather than wait 12,000 years for them to adapt to the new climate warming situation that we're witnessing. They've done that for 12,000 years, ever since the early days of agriculture. We need that to happen now within a matter of a few years. So I think whether it is climate change mitigation technologies or whether it is the agri-food system, we can create solutions that are more resilient, that can save the planet in terms of less greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide, methane, and so on, allow for cell-based and plant-based manufacturing of high-value proteins for humans and for that matter for animals. However, again here, there's a threat, and the threat is that just as Europe saw it in a different way in the early days of pharmaceutical biotechnology, where countries like Germany, with NGOs that were highly active and so on, simply didn't accept the use of gene-modified organisms, even for life-saving therapeutics like insulin. That came years later after many, many big debates and so on and so forth. I'm afraid that what we have now in the US and India and China is very liberal legislation, which doesn't make me scared because it makes sense. These are all biodegradable substances. There's no pollution element, no danger element. This is not the early days of Monsanto. This is the days of CRISPR-Cas and so on. What I'm afraid of is that Europe has a totally outdated legislation. Biodegradable solutions, biosolutions, are being treated as chemistry. Dating from the 1990s, there is not a legislation in place in the EU framework that allows for what I'm talking about to come to fruition. Hence, whatever we discover or our researchers discover may end up being implemented early on in India, China, and the United States, which is good for them, but a little bit unfortunate for the European community. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you for this. A very important challenge. I have a very unruly panel. They're touching on all my other questions by answering my first question. But definitely, let's come back to this. I think the issue of regulation, especially in the global context, is a really, really important one. And there are different aspects to that topic.
Just one further comment. I would say, though, that the prospects of gene editing and stem cell-based regenerative medicines in human health are extremely exciting, but I will let others talk to those topics.
Absolutely, thank you. And I really appreciate you reminding us all how broad biotech really is. Sometimes there's a tendency to think just in the context of agriculture, for example, or just in the context of biomedicine. But you know, if you have a beer afterwards, that's a product of biotechnology as well, right? So exactly. Minister, I come to you now. Although originally by training you are also a scientist, but of course today your focus is much broader. So from your perspective today as a minister, particularly focused on a state in India, what do you see as most exciting?
Well, firstly, I agree with you that my fellow panelists are very unruly. They've actually stolen my thoughts as well. So some of my thoughts, not all of them. Unruly. Jokes apart, I think it's an extremely important subject. You know, I'm a biotechnologist by training, but now, of course, it's been 25 years, so I've forgotten most of the biology that was taught. But I do believe in one thing. Now, the last 9 years of being a minister for information technology, coming from India, you know, the vaccine capital of the world, you know, one of the most important biotech hubs, and also one of the most important technology hubs. I believe that technology and its power to act as a force multiplier is something that is hugely undermined at this point. It is yet to be unleashed. Now, what am I talking about? Especially the pandemic. You know, it is literally shown as a mirror. The power to leverage AI, the power to leverage quantum computing, the ability to harness, augmented reality, combine it with, of course, the power of science, and enhance it by these technologies. I think you have a number of solutions even cutting across the first world, second world, and the third world. Now, if you have to focus on one specific bit and how it could help, I'd say it will also help you do better drug discovery. It will help you administer in a more focused manner, you know, the precision medicine and the other things that people talk about, to actually cater to the patient who requires it, and in general prepare better healthcare solutions and better personalized solutions. And again, as Matt said, I think at the WEF over the last 3 days, I don't think there's been a single session where climate change was not discussed. Now, industrial biotechnology, again, the power of industrial biotech to come out with resilient solutions, you know, to the climate changing situations is again hugely undermined and hugely underestimated, even in a country like India where biology and technology both are strong. By the way, I come from a city, just to plug in my city, that's my fiduciary responsibility. I come from a city, a state in India, which is with a capital city called Hyderabad, where we actually produce 1/3 of global vaccines. Come next year, we'll be producing 50% of global vaccines. The 2 indigenous vaccines that came out of India for the pandemic, for the corona, actually both came from my city. In fact, one of the leading captains of the industry sitting right in front of me, a gentleman Prasad, who represents Dr. Reddy Labs. The point I'm trying to make is also we are equally strong in technology. Now, we are trying to make this marriage happen between biology and technology, between life sciences and data sciences, and cook something up magnificent so that the world at large can be served better.
Thank you very much. And let me stay with you for 1 second here. You mentioned a couple of seconds ago that power, that force multiplying power of biotechnology. And you talked about that at scale, really true scale production of vaccine in your home city. There is quite a lot of discussion here at the forum around meaningful job creation and talent creation. Can you speak to that from your perspective, from your context, through that biotechnology lens? So there's an aspect of talent creation, so education and job creation.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the fascinating things about the country I represent, India, is 50% of my country is less than the age of 27. 65% of India is less than the age of 35. So we have a very young think force, not workforce, but think force. Because in a knowledge economy, cutting across the spectrum of activities that we all render, that we all get involved in, I think the power of youth, the power of what they can bring in terms of disruption is hugely underestimated. Now, biology, again, like I said, with all due respect to nature, because a lot of the a lot of the scientific labs in India are heavily focused on research, on getting their papers into the scientific journals, and not so much on the real world application of it. But we are trying to bring about a synergy of that as well. We're trying to synthesize something, to align what happens in these wonderful scientific labs, the best of scientific minds, for them to understand what the real world requires. And therein lies, I think, the ability to create new jobs, ability to create more economic opportunities. And India can not only help solve its problems, but I think by extension, because we are 1/5 of humanity, we can actually solve several problems that the world is facing right now. In fact, like I said, if we can supply almost 70% of vaccines, if you include a couple of other cities that are not in my province, we produce 70% of the world vaccines. Now, the ability for India to actually do more and actually come out with more original molecules and more original ideas is there, but it just has to be synchronized in the way we do research, in the way we bring them to market. That alignment is something that's missing. That's something I am very, very focused and upbeat about.
That's really important. And just to follow up on your comment about the perceived dichotomy of focus between sort of academic pursuits.
No, but with all due respect to the scientists in the room, please, don't get me wrong.
And real life impact.
Yes.
I think that dichotomy needs to disappear.
Absolutely.
It shouldn't exist there. And incidentally, you mentioned my journal. That is something we're very firmly focused on. Our interest has grown and evolved, not beyond, but to include, to extend research that has impact on real life, without a doubt, absolutely critical and ever relevant. Again, a couple of points that we'll come back to. You also referred to, as Joanna was referring to earlier, about that comparison between biotech and other tech sectors, and I want to come back to this in a minute. But let me focus on collaboration aspect. So throughout your responses here, throughout your interventions, we had reference to the private sector, the public sector, different disciplines. We talked about the different disciplines that biotechnology touches on. We talked about the necessary proximity between biotech and other tech, and AI in particular. And we also talked about different geographic locations. So Mads very specifically talked about the difference, the sort of economic, regulatory, legislative difference in between Europe and the US. The theme of this year's meeting is collaboration in the divided, fragmented world. How does that look from your perspective in the biotech sector? And I want to turn to Jason and Joanna first, because by the very nature of your organizations, you need to bring different expertise together. What are the challenges, and what's the opportunity? What works already today?
You want to start, Joanna?
Yeah, go.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go first. All right. Yeah, I think it's actually a key topic, and I'll build on what Ram said around say drug discovery, right, has been perceived as It's a very high science activity. It's done even in the U.S. in like 3 or 4 cities, basically, and enormous talent density issues and all these things. Okay, let's compare that to starting internet companies, right? I guarantee in your province there, lots of internet companies are getting launched, right? And the reason is that there's a set of platform infrastructure in the IT world that allows that to be done easily anywhere in the world. So you have Amazon Web Services. This is you have a giant data center that Amazon's spending billions of dollars, huge amounts of technology and capital build that's available to you as a new internet company on a small service basis, okay? You have operating systems. You want to launch on a mobile phone, you don't have to develop the technology to make your software work on the phone. You have to follow Apple's rules and make use of their common operating system that cuts across those phones. Same with Android. We don't have that in biotech. Every single project is a unique flower. Everything is done in-house. Everybody has their own particular R&D pipeline, intellectual property stack, and everything else. A nightmare. Okay, and so this ends up really hurting the democratization of the technology. It's why we only make drugs in Cambridge and San Francisco, which just so happened to be where we invented genetic engineering 45 years ago, right? Like that's lunacy, right? So what we're hoping, and I think Joanna can speak to this too, with an approach of adopting a platform business model in biotech, which is how Ginkgo works. We're sort of like an AWS. We haven't mentioned all that robotics and automation. We have close to $500 million on a facility in Boston that any company in the world can access on a service basis. So you can discover drugs in another country. You can make use of our infrastructure. You can make use of our intellectual property. It's all available to you as a platform. We're trying to bring that model in to tech, in from tech into biotech, but it's a new model. And it does come with challenges. So maybe I'll pass it off. But I do think it's a real opportunity if we can work that challenge out of how to bring that kind of platform model around intellectual property and technology into biotech. It would lead to a lot more democratization of the technology.
Thank you. And Joanna, if you can follow up on this, I know that your sort of core expertise over the years has really been in the tech, and now you're bringing this into this biotech setting, and I think you've had some interesting observations and interesting experiences around that transition.
Well, in tech, when you build a platform, you launch it, you announce it, there's rationale behind it, you've researched the market, you're doing something that's truly innovative and people value it, and everyone gives it a try. In this industry, and I think it's in many ways it's right because you're dealing with people's lives and patient health, so it's a much more cautious industry. We have a very prolific drug discovery engine that, as I mentioned, takes advantage of all the biomedical data we can ingest over the past 4.5 years, and it really gives scientists superpowers. So it's logical that you would want to be able to roll this out to tens of thousands of scientists. But the industry wants to see a drug that's been developed using that get to phase 2, at least, before they say, okay, this thing actually works. When, in tech, you can prove it with the data. And in this industry, they don't quite yet believe it, even if you have the data. So the most important thing is to move that value inflection point up and gain the confidence that the science is robust. It's going to lead to a novel development of a novel drug, and to prove that proposition. But there's a gap now between that proof case, which takes, as you all know, a long time. So we have a discovery engine, as I said, very prolific, can discover novel targets in any disease area. That's the other thing, it's disease agnostic, because we ingest all the world's biomedical information, whereas other companies look and they fish in one pond. They go into one therapy area, they go deep, they build phenotypic, models and they look to try to convolute or try to deconvolute that data and find a signal in one particular area, or they run robotics on images, and there's all these great approaches. But the thing about complex multifactorial diseases is that you don't always find the answer in the disease area. Sometimes you have to look 2, 3, 4, 5 hops in that knowledge graph to understand what's happening in that disease and what's driving its development for that particular patient in order to be more accurate and to develop a drug that will actually work. So the challenge is, we're a bit ahead of ourselves, and so what we had to do is actually take these drugs into the clinic ourselves. So we have 15 named drug programs in our pipeline that have been developed using our platform, and we're starting the process of taking them through. Now, in terms of collaboration, that takes a lot of money. So we have our phase 2 readout this quarter in our first clinical trial drug. And then we have another one that's a really exciting novel drug for ulcerative colitis that's starting clinical trials mid-year. But, that takes a lot of money. So we're looking to partner some of the remaining assets in the pipeline. But again, you have to take someone who's going to take a bet on the data package. And, we have full wet labs in Cambridge in the UK. So we're not just saying, look, here's a novel idea and here's a little bit of data that supports it. We have, human tissue samples and, experiments where we're showing an effect in those experiments. And, we have that proof now. So, but it's just about bringing people into this process early on and looking at this and saying, like, this thing can actually produce high volumes of substrate that we can take advantage of.
Very interesting. Can I press you on something you just said? Mm-hmm. So the way I understood the sort of landscape as you were charting it, and correct me if this is a misrepresentation of what you said, but I sort of heard you say that you wished you were able to just do an outstanding job at that platform information mining stage. Yeah. And then partner with others to do this wet lab, tissue, cell, drug trial part. But that's not what's expected of you at the moment. That's what you said. Now, is it possible to say, let's give you a crystal ball. Mm-hmm. Can you try and predict, can you envisage in future this happening? So that this whole sector pivoting to something that you are familiar with from a tech sector, that this whole pipeline happens in the context of a collaboration, a partnership, mm-hmm. as opposed to you having to prove it in the first instance?
Yeah. Well, the one way in which we're trying to solve for this is to get this suite of tools in the hands of tens of thousands of scientists. I mean, we were talking about business models earlier. It's very important for us, now that this is built and it's producing high quality science, that we can launch this platform and these tools in a model that scientists everywhere can have access to. And Jason was mentioning the cloud, and the way things operate today, if you have a platform that operates on the cloud, theoretically people can use it from anywhere in the world. So that's a really powerful concept. And if you have a full suite of tools that enable them to explore disease biology in unprecedented detail and to make better decisions, and as I said, it's like you ask in silico and questions, in real time, complex multifactorial questions, and you get the answer in real time. And that's really powerful. So if we can democratize access to the tools, if we can enable tens of thousands of scientists to benefit from this research, then we've done something really important for the world. So we have, two business models really, and the economics of those two models are completely different. A SaaS model is a completely different approach for a business like ours.
Absolutely. Mads, let me come back to the point you made earlier around regulation. Would you be prepared to comment on what would be your sort of dream regulatory environment for biotech to really take off, make the most of that confluence with other tech? And then I'm going to ask actually anybody here on the panel to comment on it more in a global setting. Because we touched on those global differences. Joanna just talked about opening up for researchers to use this everywhere in the world. But we know the regulatory environments and rules are quite different in different places. What's the opportunity there?
Yep. If I can start in the pharmaceutical arena, because for the past 20 years, our company, Novo, has looked at around 100 biotech companies every year to collaborate with, to partner with. And more often than not, we had to decline, not because the drug target was not validated and molecule wasn't interesting, but simply because as you scale up towards, in particular, phase 2 and phase 3 with commercial scale production and quality, the quality was not there. I mean, the regulatory scrutiny that FDA and EMA will expose you to as you submit your BLA or your drug application is humongous and very much overlooked by many small startup companies. So I think there's a huge rationale for having extremely strong providers of excellent drug discovery, research, and early development. But do remember every now and then to think about partnerships at the right point in time, because either you're going to get a very expensive penalty round, or maybe no round at all. So that's just one big arena of collaboration between major companies like Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Roche, and small companies that do excellent work. When it comes to the regulatory scrutiny, and if we took ATMPs, Advanced Therapy Medicine Products, I can tell you that it has not been sorted out yet. When you look at stem cell-based regenerative medicines, there is still a lot of alignment to happen between regulatory agencies, but they do meet across the Atlantic to discuss these matters, and it's work in progress. And we'll have to realize that the same goes with ex vivo and in particular in vivo gene editing of chronic monogenetic diseases in humans. So ongoing work. When it comes to the use of biotechnology in what I would call planetary health, there it's quite clear that in the US and for that matter India and China, there is a lenient and very facilitative regulatory framework, because they have come to realize that this is no longer UV radiation or chemical induction of mutagenesis. This is in fact highly site-specific CRISPR-mediated gene editing or whatever it might be. And what I tried to say just before was that this is not the case in Europe. We are not bad off when it comes to technology. I think we have some excellent things happening, but we do really need to give the regulatory framework a major overhaul sooner rather than later, which I had a chance to discuss with the Commissioner earlier today for research and innovation. When that is said, I would say in this area, there's a huge potential for collaboration, because the companies that exist, they're doing agriculture the old-fashioned way with nitrogen-based fertilizers and have not used these technologies. And likewise, the food industry is making livestock production of meat and whatnot. They are not used to using these technologies. So we need a marriage between some of the tech providers, some of the excellent academic scientists who understand how to create resilient crops, and then the existing body of major companies that need to change. Just like Shell and Exxon need to change from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the same goes for the agri-food system.
Excellent points. And so
I would just add a small thing to that. I couldn't agree more. I think these areas outside of medicine especially, and particularly in the EU, there's a lot of, I mean, climate is top priority. Actually, all the big regulations, the regulations that are driving sustainable aviation fuel and all that stuff is coming out of the EU. The technology that's going to deliver that is industrial biotechnology. I mean, it really is, right? If you look at food system, it's a huge contributor. That's going to be revolutionized. Plant-based meats, entirely, a technology of biotech, right? Carbon removal. What is the only scalable thing that takes carbon out of the atmosphere right now?
If you ever
plants, right? It's obviously going to be technology of agricultural biotechnology if you want to have any impact in the next 5 to 10 years of any type of carbon removal from the atmosphere, period. And so, I mean, it's shooting itself in the foot, and it's not lost in the U.S. The President Biden announced an executive order on a bioeconomy just 3 months ago to coordinate across all major agencies around their plans for economic development in the U.S. around biotech. Launched the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech. I'm the chair of it. They did one of these 3 years ago for AI that Eric Schmidt was the chair of, because biotech is as important as AI, right? On a strategic basis for the country, right? So I think this is it's surprising to me, also given the importance of climate in the EU, that it's backwards in this way. It really is. But you're seeing the U.S. move quickly.
We should talk much more, or you should join the foundation, whatever.
Happy to serve. Yeah.
So I want to bring it back to you, Minister, because of course, what I'm hearing here is that perhaps governments, legislators, policymakers don't hear enough directly from the technologists, the businesses, the researchers. Now, from your perspective, so I have two aspects to this question. One is from your perspective as member of the cabinet. Do you feel that you have access to that direct knowledge? Is there a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue in the context of your state and Indian politics? And my second question is, I think it was Mads who said conversation across the Atlantic. Now let's look at the map. Do you feel India is sufficiently part of the global conversation around, especially around regulation around the new emerging technologies? Because that's a real opportunity.
Honestly, the pandemic has really shown us a mirror, I think, to all governments across the world. And I speak, I think, for lots of them, because, when I was watching Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, on television, lamenting about the lack of ventilators and other things, important equipment, it has exposed the inadequacies in terms of medical infrastructure. It has also exposed the loopholes in regulatory framework. The reason why I say this is because only after the pandemic has hit, even in India, we realized that we need to fast track our approvals. Our approval systems are, I'm sorry to say this for lack of a better word, pathetic, because 7 to 8 years to develop a certain a drug or a vaccine. I understand, like Joanna said, it's important because you're talking about people's lives, you're talking about humans. It's important, I understand, but at the same time, we've also realized that it could be fast-tracked, it could be expedited. Yeah. That is something that was missing. The second aspect this pandemic has shown all of us, every government in the world, without multilateral cooperation, without the countries talking to each other, without governments talking to each other, we will not be able to solve the problems. We have to straddle the three worlds, the developed world, the not-so-developed world, and the world that's somewhere in between. Unless we straddle these worlds, unless we bring about a common alignment. One way of doing that, for instance, is we are launching a Center for Industrial Revolution focused on life sciences in partnership with the World Economic Forum in my city. And I believe that the World Economic Forum really does offer a great opportunity for me to be able to connect with some of the policy think tanks, some of the leading biotechnologists, some of the leading technology players, and bring about the best from the world, or concatenate it, and then cook something up which is unique and which is something universal. The second point I'd make on this whole issue, when you think of what has been happening, in fact, I was at a dinner last night where the discussion was completely centered on NCDs. Now, we've of course all been obsessed with the pandemic, and everybody in your home has become a doctor because everybody's been receiving so many comments through WhatsApp, Facebook, and so many suggestions. But the fact is, NCDs continue to remain a major pain point for governments across the world. Now, how do we ensure NCDs, again, come back into the center stage of the discussion?
NCD, non-communicable disease, right?
Yep. Yes, exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry, non-communicable diseases, which kill more people than any pandemic is. You see, in India, for instance, we are the diabetes capital of the world. I was just sharing with Jason and Mads that my diabetes was diagnosed incidentally. I had to go for insurance policy, and then the guy says, you have to pay a higher premium. I said, why would I do that? He said, you're diabetic. I said, I had no clue. Then I get checked again, then I realize I am at the age of 30. So the point I'm trying to make is, all these NCDs, diabetes, cardiovascular problems, respiratory problems, oncology problems, these are major issues that we need to tackle. It's not just the pandemic, it's not just the microbial infections, the communicable diseases. There is a huge opportunity for us to collaborate across. We are also setting up, by the way, the World Health Organization's mRNA vaccine hub in Hyderabad. So we'll work with WEF, we'll work with WHO, we'll work with other governments across the world. We have to. I mean, we don't really have a choice. And I think we also have to fast track and, like Matt said, beat up our regulators a bit and make sure they understand the urgency of the situation. And move forward, I guess.
Exactly. Fantastic. Is there one burning question from the audience? We have time probably for one question, if there is one. Yes, please go ahead. If you just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Rima Chakrabarti, physician and early stage biotech investor. The question I have is, especially as we talk about AI, as we talk about kind of creating the AWS for bioengineering, can you talk about data set generation? Part of what I think in the US we see is data is the valuable source, and what you do with the data can almost become the commodity because the data is how you get to that precision understanding. Companies, like pharma companies, for example, tend to hold that data close to the chest in the US. And I've seen a distinction between the US and maybe the UK, where the UK Biobank is far more open to a lot of companies that we've been looking at, and they're able to build off that data infrastructure. Can you talk about how you think about the value of data, and would love any comments?
I'll have a quick comment on that. In fact, in my state, we're doing something very interesting. We're in the process of executing a project which profiles every citizen on 57 different health parameters. We've completed the pilot project with about 500,000 people. I mean, 500,000 is a big number elsewhere, but in India, it's a very small number. Thing is, what we've realized, for instance, in my district, which is where we've done the pilot, we've seen a heavy prevalence of cancer when you start analyzing the data. So the next thing I'm going to do is use predictive analytics to set up an oncology unit in the government hospital that I'm setting up. Another district, we saw a lot of cardiovascular problems. So we obviously have a large cardiology section there. I think this sort of planning, this sort of, data mining, and then using it, of course, with consent, of course, with the consent of the citizens, putting part of it at least on the cloud. So to democratize and to give access to investors such as yourself, I think will be, the way forward, because I think that will expedite a lot of very interesting developments in biology and technology. That's what I think.
Thank you for this. We've done history of biotech industry. We've done comparison of biotech with other tech sectors, seen how biotech is special in many ways, but that doesn't mean it cannot learn from adjacent tech sectors, and in fact that it must. We talked about collaboration, importance of collaboration across disciplines and across sectors and across the globe, crucially, also in the context of the regulatory systems. And just now, thank you for that question, we talked about data, and actually your answer illustrated the importance of engaging the wider society in biotech, in approaches to how biotech can be harnessed to solve questions, and data sharing with appropriate consent, of course. Thank you very much to my panel, and thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. You did a lovely job.
Thank you.